This reading or this video is for reading 56, which is entitled Toward a New Vision, Race, Class, and Gender as Categories of Analysis and Connection. It was written by Dr. Patricia Hill Collins. So this reading starts with an Audre Lorde quote. Audre Lorde is a well-known Black feminist activist and writer. Um, the quote, "The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within us." So the author says that this quote is significant because oftentimes people identify the most comfortable oppression as being the one that is fundamental, the one that they most often use to understand their own lives, as well as the lives and experiences of people around them. And other types of oppression they see as being of lesser importance. And usually, the oppression that people are most comfortable with is the oppression which they inhabit the subordinate position. Because keep in mind, and this goes back to that old definition from Peggy McIntosh about privilege, that it is an invisible knapsack of unearned advantages or assets. When we have privilege, it is oftentimes invisible. But when we don't have privilege, when we are in the subordinate position and we face, prejudice, discrimination, because of that subordinate status, it is very visible to us. And we usually, we mobilize around this identity. We consider all the ways in which it is unfair. And so this is the type of oppression that we're more comfortable with, right? The oppression where we are the victim. But as Dr. Hills Collins notes, there are very few pure victims or oppressors. Each of us derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege in society. And so this is really kind of the point of this reading. To get at the oppressor, which is planted deep within us, Collins suggests two things. We need new visions of what oppression is, and we need to change our daily behavior. Related to these two objectives, she focuses the reading around two basic questions. First, how can we reconceptualize race, class, and gender as categories of analysis? And second, how can we transcend the barriers created by our experiences with race, class, and gender oppression in order to build the types of coalitions essential for social change? Lord points out, and Collins agrees, that change needs to start with the self, and the relationships that we have must be the primary site for social change. And so, it is this view that, change needs to start from the self, that, Dr. Hills Collins is taking in this piece, right? So this reading is focused more on kind of this individual, the kind of individual arena, although she does go on to link it to the larger structural and symbolic arenas that exist in society. But that first question, how can we reconceptualize race, class, and gender as categories of analysis? Well, she begins this part by just addressing the ways in which the older additive approaches, the reasons why they don't work. And for her, it kind of comes down to two primary things. First of all, the additive approaches depend a lot on dichotomous thinking, right? You're a man or you're a woman, you're Black, you're white. There's thoughts and then there's feelings, there are facts and there are opinions. And going along with this dichotomous thinking is oftentimes the, ranked and hierarchical ordering of these categories. So oftentimes, one of the categories is described as being the dominant position, and the other category is described as being the subordinate position. And she goes over the reasons why she finds this problematic. First of all, this type of thinking makes the idea of being both simultaneously oppressed and the oppressor conceptually impossible. This type of thinking also encourages the assumption that oppression can be quantified, and that some groups are more oppressed than others, and that some of your social identities cause you more oppression than others. And she kind of rejects this. Although, she does say that, in specific contexts, sometimes one social identity category does have salience over others. And to support this, she provides some specific examples there on page 589. But she says, acknowledging and recognizing that the salience of some categories in specific contexts does not minimize the need to reconceptualize these concepts, to emphasize that they are, in fact, as opposed to being additive, they are parallel interlocking systems. So, after establishing why the old approaches don't work, she moves on to uncover and discuss the connection that exists among race, class, and gender by focusing on three main dimensions of oppression that they all share: institutional, symbolic, and individual dimensions of oppression. So, she begins with the institutional, dimension of oppression. And she starts off by just stating, whether by design or accident, American social institutions discriminate. This is kind of key for a lot of sociologists. By and large, a lot of research in our discipline has shown the ways in which discrimination occurs overtly, covertly, based upon historical precedent, still occurring in contemporary settings, in social institutions. And so, Collins begins by, just making that clear. But then she provides an extended discussion of how slavery, which we oftentimes think about solely through the lens of race, also was predicated and built upon, interlocking systems of oppression, not just race, but gender and class. And I'm not going to go over that extended discussion in the video. I encourage you to read that very closely, though, and that's pages 590 to 591. The next dimension of oppression is symbolic. And in this section, she begins by saying socially sanctioned ideologies are used to justify relations of domination and subordination. And part of how they do this is by using stereotypes, or what she calls controlling images. And these images are, they're disseminated, in throughout social institutions, obviously through the media, but also, in the educational system, in the lessons that are taught, in the texts that are used. These controlling images can be disseminated, through religion, even in science. She goes a little deeper about how, oftentimes these stereotypes, and we already know that stereotypes, of course, are not true, right? They're taking qualities, and they're applying them broadly to a group. But she also points out that even when we're applying them broadly to a group, we oftentimes are aware that they are not universal, that even within that group, the stereotypes, usually are only meant to really refer to a subset of that population. And in order to demonstrate how that works, she goes over what I feel like is a pretty cool gender symbolism activity where, she asks students to think about, how they would describe, masculine and feminine characteristics. And then she points out that a lot of these characteristics are really based on white, kind of middle class, experiences and lives and expectations, that these types of, this type of word association changes once you start, adding race or even class, to the identity. And she says on 592 something that I think is pretty interesting, that when we use these supposed universal images, when we say, this is what masculinity is, this is what femininity is, or even, this is what, African American is, this is what the Latin X experience is, or, this is what it means to be working class, this is what it means to be, middle class. When we use these supposed universal images, we oftentimes dehumanize people that don't fit those images, whether it's because they're poor, whether it's because they're people of color, but, we dehumanize them because we're rendering their lived experiences invisible. And that brings me to the final, the kind of final dimension of oppression that she talks about in this section, which is the individual dimension. You know, she points out that we all live within institutions that reproduce race, class, and gender oppression, and we encounter the images related to those groups and the symbolic meanings attached to those images. And so in this way, they become embedded in us. And we must come to terms with how these categories of analysis have framed our own individual biographies, how we've thought about ourselves, how we have been treated by others, how we've been treated within institutions, who we have formed relationships with. Um, and what she really notes is that sometimes even when our lives change, right, and she points specifically to like class mobility, um even when our lives change, there is oftentimes this lasting impact of of the ways in which our early biographies were shaped. And she says that oftentimes one way that we can see this lasting impact is by our relationships with other people. If you primarily have your closest relationships, and this is like mentoring, this is friendships, this is intimacy and significant others. If your closest relationships are largely with people who share the same social identities as what does that really say about the impact that these analytical categories have in our lives? And so that brings me to that second question, which is how can we transcend barriers created by our experiences with race, class, and gender oppression in order to build the type of coalitions essential for social change? And this question reflects that second step, which involves us, trying to build relationships and coalitions with people who may not share our social identities, but using those social identities as a way to connect with people, as opposed to as using them as a way of erecting barriers, um, and being kind of a source of conflict. So she identifies three issues that are involved when it comes to doing this, to taking this step. The first one has to deal with differences in power and privilege, right? Because we all have our own little unique matrix of domination slash subordination. But certainly some of us do enjoy and inhabit more privileged positions, while others of us inhabit less privileged positions. And it can be hard to have honest discussions and to build relationships built upon honesty and transparency and understanding when you have these different social positions and that have differential levels of power in society. So one thing that she emphasizes here is the importance of spaces that can minimize those differences. And the space that she holds up, of course, is college classrooms, that shared achieved status of college student um, uh, makes it possible for the ascribed statuses, your race, your class, your gender, that come with power differentials. Sharing that status as a student, though, opens up the possibility that in a college classroom setting you can encounter people who, even though they are different than you, because you have that shared social status, it might make you more open to hearing viewpoints that you have not necessarily heard. And it's occurring in a setting where outside of that setting, people might perceive and treat you very differently. But within that setting, hopefully your professor is largely treating you the same. The second issue involved in creating these coalitions and forming these relationships, and actually this one is very specifically related to coalitions, is knowing the real reasons for a coalition and building the coalition around those reasons. One thing that she mentions is that while a shared enemy can foster group solidarity, these types of politically expedient relationships are fragile, right? Because they're not really built on a commitment to a specific issue or a commitment to enacting a specific type of social change is kind of built on just, this idea, oh, we hate the same people. Um, and although it might work in the short term, it's unlikely to work in the long term. There's just not enough there for you to build both personal relationships around, but also, of course, a organizational kind of relationship around. So the best coalitions require slash mandate collaboration, and the key to collaboration is, empathy and really truly listening and trying to understand people's points of view and their perspectives, and you know sometimes this is a struggle and sometimes this is difficult, but in order to have a really good coalition that has the potential to be long lasting and effective, this is key. Which brings me to that third issue, because it also relates to empathy. It also brings in this concept of accountability, because race, class, and gender oppression, as she mentions, they form the structural backdrop, where we frame our relationships, where we understand our own identities. And this backdrop has been in existence in this country since the very beginning, right? So it can become very easy for people to kind of not be accountable to their own kind of beliefs and attitudes and actions that contribute to it, and instead just say, like, oh, that happened 200 years ago, or oh, that has nothing to do with me, or oh, I wasn't the one that did X, Y, and Z. And this is where Collins says empathy is a key component for accountability. Because if you can truly empathize with the experience of individuals and groups of people who are different from yourself, if you can take a real interest, in their lived experiences and the ways in which oppression shapes their lived experiences, then hopefully you would build upon that empathy to then be accountable, to being willing to work, and to address problems and find solutions, even for situations that didn't originate with you, and don't even necessarily directly concern you or affect you. And one thing that I really like about this reading is that she notes on page 595 that having empathy is difficult no matter which side of privilege we inhabit. She discusses why it's difficult for people who approach it from the privileged status, because keep in mind, one key component of privilege is it is usually invisible, and it is uncomfortable to take a hard look at the ways in which your life might have been shaped by privileges, that you did not earn, that you enjoy solely due to your social identity. This requires a good deal of discomfort, as well as self-awareness, and that's difficult. On the other side, it is also difficult from people from the subordinate side, who once again are kind of coming into these relationships and these coalitions with experiences based on their subordinate status, where they were perhaps stigmatized or mistreated or discriminated against, and it's led them to have a certain amount of distrust of people, who are from the dominant group, and they have their own stereotypes and biases against people from the dominant group. And if they hold on to these biases and prejudices, of course, it will make meaningful relationships that cross these privilege lines impossible. So she ends this reading the same way she starts, with the Audre Lorde quote. And that quote, each of us is called upon to take a stand. So in these days ahead, as we examine ourselves and each other, our works, our fears, our differences, our sisterhood and survivals, I urge you to tackle what is most difficult for us all: self-scrutiny of our complacencies, the idea that since each of us believes she is on the side of right, she need not examine her position. And she ends with that quote, and that is what she encourages us to do, to examine our own position, that is the place to actually start when enacting this social change related to systematic oppression. So the question I encourage you to consider is actually just based on Collins' advice. If you were asked to examine your own position in society, what would you say? Before taking this course, reading this piece, how might you have described your social identities and the impact that they have had on your lived experiences, your close relationships, your support of different policies or ideologies, and or your belief in certain images or stereotypes? In what ways does this piece encourage you to think differently and act differently? How likely are you to make these changes slash incorporate them into your understanding and or daily routine?